Laughter rang out before the thunder had time to break, sharp and cold like metal scraping against stone. The woman at the head of the board pointed straight at the newly built flood wall, her lips curling with open contempt, while the man holding a clipboard declared it had to be removed immediately or the house would be foreclosed. None of them noticed the silver-haired woman standing behind the glass door, trembling as memories of rising water surged back into her body. Caleb Hartman did not respond right away. He stood still on the gravel driveway, both hands relaxed at his sides, as if he were listening to a sound only he could hear. The salty wind from the marsh rolled into the Seabreeze Palms neighborhood, carrying the heavy, damp breath of a storm, compressing itself along the horizon. The low stone wall tracing the edge of his property reflected the gray-silver light of late afternoon, its drainage channels carefully hidden beneath lush green planters. It was not a fortress, it was a promise. The woman, Vivian Halstead, was whispered about behind her back by neighbors using another name, one tied to constant scrutiny and hollow authority. Karen. She laughed and turned toward the group behind her, nods of agreement passing through them like a familiar ritual. Her husband, Brent Halstead Jr., the board president, raised his voice, speaking about community standards, about aesthetics, about protecting property values. Each word landed like a hammer strike, each one aimed squarely at the man they considered beneath them. Inside the house, Evelyn Hartman stood frozen at the kitchen counter. The laughter outside pierced through the glass walls and transformed into the sound of water rushing inside her head. She turned toward the coffee machine as if seeing it for the first time, confusion filling her eyes. "Caleb, is the water coming in again?" The question slipped out fragile and thin, tightening his chest. The last flood had risen too fast. Sirens screaming, people shouting, Evelyn crying for days. Lost inside her own home, he had sworn it would never happen again. Caleb stepped forward one pace, just one. His voice was low and steady, like placing stones carefully onto solid ground. "This is a flood protection structure. It is entirely on my property. It has permits. It has proper drainage design. It has passed inspection." Vivian waved her hand, expensive perfume unable to mask the cruelty underneath. "It is ugly. It ruins the look of the neighborhood. It looks like the kind of cheap thing we do not allow here." She spoke as if reading out a sentence. The wind shifted. A dark band of clouds began to coil in the distance. Caleb looked past them and saw the sky collapsing in layers. He thought about the mornings spent measuring ground slope, the nights redrawing water paths on paper, the $9,200 he pulled from his last savings, not to challenge anyone, but to let Evelyn sleep in peace. He thought about families in the middle section, homes flooded and then fined for tall grass, peeling paint, crooked mailboxes. He thought about the low mechanical hum of pumps in the distance during rainy nights, a sound that did not belong to nature. Brent delivered the ultimatum. 30 days. Remove it voluntarily, or the board would begin foreclosure proceedings. The nods appeared again. A few neighbors avoided Caleb's eyes. A few others glanced at the wall with quiet hope. No one spoke. Caleb smiled. Not a friendly smile. The smile of a man who had spent his entire life understanding pressure, flow, and laws that could not be bent. "Do not mess with someone who understands water," he said softly, "especially when a storm is coming." Thunder cracked. Closer now. Vivian raised an eyebrow and laughed louder, as if to drown out the flicker of unease that had just passed through her. She turned away and motioned for the group to disperse, leaving behind a road damp with mist. Caleb remained where he was, watching them go, then turned back inside. He placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, feeling her trembling breath slowly settle. He whispered that he was here, that everything would be all right. Outside, the wind strengthened. Water began searching for its path. And in Seabreeze Palms, those who were used to giving orders were about to learn a lesson as old as the ground beneath their feet. No one in Seabreeze Palms knew that the 3 houses along the canal had been spared from flooding by a system that did not exist on any official map. All they knew was that every rainy season, the water somehow chose another path. Seabreeze Palms sat tucked against the edge of the marsh like a manufactured resort, where lawns were trimmed as straight as rulers, and palm trees were planted at such perfect intervals they looked like a display model. Mornings smelled of roasted coffee and lawnmowers. Evenings glowed with soft yellow lights reflecting off the canal. People called it paradise, but every paradise has its gatekeeper. Brent Halstead Jr. was that gatekeeper. He showed up at every board meeting in crisp shirts with the confident smile of a man used to giving orders. In his eyes, Seabreeze Palms was not a neighborhood, but a living asset. Something that needed protection from what he called risks. Those risks usually looked like people who were not like him, people who worked with their hands, plumbers, truck drivers, retirees, living on fixed incomes. Vivian, his wife, enforced rules that were never written down. She walked every evening with her phone held high, documenting mismatched door colors, misplaced planters. Music played too loudly. She never shouted. She smiled and sent letters. The letters always sounded like community concern, but their edges were sharp as knives. To those she targeted, she had a name no one needed to say out loud: Karen. Malcolm Reeve, the board treasurer, lived in the largest house along the canal. He was a doctor, his voice slow and heavy like a lecture. He spoke about ethics, order, responsibility. Few people noticed that every time the rain came hard, the lights in his house stayed on while the middle section of the neighborhood began to stain with water like spilled ink. Caleb Hartman did not move here for the scenery. He came for quiet. After Evelyn's diagnosis, he needed a place that was not too loud, not too crowded, somewhere she could sit and look at trees without fear. At first, Seabreeze Palms gave him that, until the rainy season arrived. Florida rain does not ask permission. It falls as if the sky has been torn open. The first night, water crept into the yard, and Caleb stood in front of Evelyn, blocking her view as it crawled toward the steps. The second night, it entered the house. The third night, Evelyn no longer recognized the living room. She cried, repeating the same question, and Caleb felt a helplessness he had never known. Meanwhile, the next morning, Brent still jogged along the canal. Vivian still posted sunrise photos. Malcolm still drove out of his dry garage. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Caleb began walking early in the mornings, while the fog still hung low. He studied storm drains, concrete strips newer than the surrounding soil. He knelt and touched the cold surface. His old trade had never left him. Water always leaves traces for those who know how to read them. The flow had been bent. The pressure redirected. This was work done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. One morning, he met Noah Jensen, a young man from the middle section, shoveling mud from his driveway. Noah forced a smile and said his insurance had just gone up. Said they might have to sell the house. Caleb said nothing, only looked at the dried water line on the wall, higher than last year. During the nights that followed, Caleb heard a strange sound. Not rain, not wind, a machine. Low, steady, distant. It appeared when the water rose and vanished when the rain stopped. Evelyn slept poorly. Caleb did not sleep at all. He began redrawing Seabreeze Palms in his mind, not by streets or trees, but by slope and flow. The canal-side homes, which should have been the first to receive the water, stood as if on higher ground. That did not happen naturally. Caleb knew he was being underestimated. To the board, he was just a quiet man who kept his head down and avoided conflict. They did not know that 40 years earlier he had stood between broken rivers, repairing drainage systems in the dark to save entire neighborhoods. They did not know he understood water the way others understood a heartbeat. When Vivian sent her first letter about aesthetics, Caleb read it slowly. When Brent issued a violation notice, he folded it carefully. When Malcolm spoke about community safety at meetings, Caleb listened to every word, not out of fear, but because he was assembling the pieces. Outside, clouds gathered again. Inside, Caleb could already see the complete picture. In that picture, Seabreeze Palms was not paradise. It was a bowl, and someone had tilted it so the water would pour onto those without a voice. Caleb stood by the window watching the rain begin to fall. He knew everything was about to accelerate. And this time, the water would tell its own story. Water flooded into the Jensen family's garage before the rain alarm even had time to sound. A stream of black mud crawling forward like a creature with a will of its own. This time, no one could call it an accident. Caleb Hartman arrived to find Noah Jensen standing frozen, one hand gripping the car door, watching the water rise to his ankles and then higher. Lila stood on the front step holding their small child, her eyes red and swollen. They did not call for help. They had grown used to staying silent. Caleb knelt down and placed his hand into the water, feeling the cold and the pressure. He did not need to check a rain gauge. He knew the exact moment the flow had been bent. The scene spread faster than the water itself. That same morning, 3 homes in the middle section reported flooding. One family lost a washing machine. One lost insurance paperwork. One lost sleep. And across the canal, the Halstead lawn stayed dry. The driveway at the Reeve house looked freshly washed. The contrast was no longer suspicion. It was living proof. Caleb returned home under a light drizzle. Evelyn sat in her armchair, staring out the window. She asked softly if the water was coming today. Caleb sat down at eye level and told her a slow story about canals, about how water always chooses the easiest path, about banks of earth that know how to protect the people living beside them. Evelyn nodded, even if she did not fully understand. She trusted him, and that trust weighed on him like responsibility. That afternoon, Caleb opened his old toolbox. Tools long forgotten surfaced like sharpened memories. A level, measuring tape, marking pen. He walked the water's route, not using the HOA map, but the map of the land itself. He measured slope at 7 points. He recorded every patch of new concrete, every storm drain that had been turned. He took photographs, not to threaten anyone, but to tell an exact story. The plot twist came when he found what no one expected to exist. Behind a line of shrubs near the canal, tucked behind a small shed, sat a locked metal hatch. It was not listed in any community construction records. It carried no public markings. Caleb crouched and listened as rainfall increased. A faint vibration humming beneath the metal. A system was running, and it was not owned by the city. That night, the sound returned. Lower, stronger. Caleb did not sleep. He remembered old shifts, emergency nights, when he had moved water out of neighborhoods by every legal means possible. He remembered the law, the boundaries, and that real power does not announce itself. It requires evidence. The next morning, Vivian posted a long message in the community group, talking about decline and dangerous unauthorized structures. She shared photos of mud in front of the Jensen house, twisting the narrative toward blame. A few people nodded along. A few began asking questions. Malcolm commented about regulatory compliance. Brent pinned the post. Caleb did not respond. He knocked on every flooded door. He listened. He documented. He asked what time the water arrived, when it receded, whether they heard any sounds. A retired firefighter on the corner quietly mentioned a machine noise he had heard many times but never dared to report. A single mother handed over an unpaid repair invoice. The pieces came together, growing heavier by the hour. Late in the afternoon, Caleb stood by the canal. The water rose and fell, in an unnatural rhythm. He rested his hand on the railing and followed the forced direction of the flow. In that moment, he was no longer the man the board dismissed. He was someone who could read the language of water, and the water was whispering the names of those who had twisted it. He went home, opened his notebook, and drew a straight line. Not a plan for revenge, but a plan for restoration. Protecting his own house was not enough. If he stopped there, the water would find another path, and the victims would simply change names. Caleb understood that better than anyone. Evelyn touched his hand and asked what he was drawing. He smiled, and told her he was drawing a way home for the water. She nodded, her eyes softening. Outside, the rain stopped. But this quiet was not the end. It was the pause before everything was pulled into the light. Caleb closed the notebook. He knew he had crossed the line from defender to storyteller. And from this moment on, the story would no longer belong to those holding clipboards. The letter appeared in Caleb's mailbox on a clear morning, thin and white like a cold warning. The bold headline declared the structure in violation of community standards and demanded immediate correction with escalating fines for non-compliance. There was no handwritten signature, only a stamp. Power prefers to hide behind ink. Caleb read slowly, line by line, like a familiar piece of music. He folded the letter, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped outside. The flood wall stood there, silent and solid. Its stones fitted so tightly they looked as if they had always been there. Rainwater from the night before still rested in the drainage channel, flowing gently in the direction it was meant to go. Nothing needed fixing. Some things needed protecting. Vivian Halstead appeared on cue, like a staged performance. She arrived with 2 board members, phone held high, her voice loud enough for neighbors to hear. She spoke about violated aesthetics, about the need for discipline, about how one individual could not place himself above the community. She did not look at Caleb. She spoke to an imaginary audience. Caleb listened and let her finish. When she paused to breathe, he opened his old leather case and pulled out a stack of papers, building permits, engineering drawings, inspection approvals. He laid them out on the stone table in the yard, one by one, like dealing cards. No raised voice, no challenge, just truth, neatly arranged. One board member frowned. Vivian hesitated for a split second, then recovered her smile. She said permits could be reviewed, that interpretive authority belonged to the board. Brent Halstead Jr. appeared next, exactly as someone used to delivering conclusions. He talked about precedent, about how allowing one person meant everyone would follow. Caleb nodded. He was right, but he had forgotten one thing. The plot twist arrived quietly, in the form of questions. Caleb asked about the neighborhood's shared drainage records. He asked who approved the recent changes along the canal. He asked why storm drains in the middle section had been turned. The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Wind moved through the palms, leaves rustling like whispers of things kept hidden. That afternoon, Caleb sat with Evelyn on the porch. She held a cup of tea and looked at the planters built into the stone wall. She said they were beautiful. She asked if they helped the water go farther away. Caleb smiled and explained slowly. Water does not need to be pushed. It needs to be guided. Evelyn listened, nodded, and leaned against his shoulder. Some days memory fractured, but the feeling of safety did not. Across the neighborhood, Noah Jensen received another email from his insurance company. Terms had changed. Premiums increased. One more flood, and the policy would be reviewed. Lila read the message, her hand shaking. She thought about the house, their child, the possibility of having to leave. When Vivian posted again about maintaining standards, Noah did not stay silent. He commented with a single sentence, "Where did the water in my house come from?" The question spread. More comments followed. One person mentioned machine noises at night. Another described flooding without heavy rain. Malcolm Reeve joined in with a calming tone, talking about natural phenomena. But nature was no longer convincing when too many people were seeing the same anomaly. Caleb did not join the argument. He worked. He remeasured slope after the rain. He logged the times water arrived and receded. He refined the wall, adding small details to smooth the flow. Every adjustment followed old principles he had learned when young, when water and time were not things you negotiated with. That evening, Brent called. His voice was low and polite, inviting Caleb to attend an emergency board meeting, to discuss, to find solutions. Caleb agreed. He glanced at Evelyn, sleeping peacefully. He knew they expected him to come on the defensive. They did not know he was coming to open doors. Outside, clouds gathered again. No one orders the rain. and no one can stop water from finding its true path. The community room was lit far brighter than necessary, as if light itself could force the truth to sit quietly and behave. When Caleb walked in, conversations dropped to murmurs and then stopped altogether. Some people avoided his eyes, others stared straight at him, waiting for an apology that never came. Brent Halstead Jr. stood at the front, behind a long table draped in white cloth. Vivian sat to his right, back straight, her phone placed face down like a weapon temporarily set aside. Malcolm Reeves sat to the left, hands clasped, wearing the calm expression of a man accustomed to controlling other people's heartbeats. On the wall hung the HOA logo, large and pristine, a reminder of who believed they owned the room. Brent opened in a measured tone. He spoke about unity, about standards, about how one individual could not unilaterally change the shared appearance of the community. He did not mention water. He did not mention flooding. He spoke as if everything was fine and Caleb was the only problem. Vivian followed, her voice sharp and fast. She projected photos of Caleb's wall onto the screen, choosing angles that made it look rough and out of place. She talked about dangerous precedent. She asked what Seabreeze Palms would become if everyone did the same. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Caleb remained seated until Vivian finished. When he stood, the room fell completely silent. He had no speech prepared, only an old leather case. He set it on the table, opened it, and removed document after document. Building permits, engineering drawings, inspection reports. He laid them out neatly, turning each page so everyone could read it. Each sheet landed like a stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. Brent frowned. Vivian pressed her lips together. Malcolm shifted in his chair. Caleb spoke slowly, his voice even. My structure is entirely within my property lines. It has city permits. It has drainage inspections. It violates no part of the community covenants. He paused and let the words settle. Then he asked, just as slowly, where the neighborhood's shared drainage records were. Who approved the changes along the canal over the past 2 years? Whether any permits existed for storm drains in the middle section being turned. The questions hung unanswered. Wind brushed through the palms outside, leaves rustling like whispers of things kept hidden. Malcolm cleared his throat and spoke about natural causes. Brent mentioned the board's authority to interpret rules. Vivian gave a thin smile and accused Caleb of deflecting. The plot twist did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with names. Caleb addressed them one by one, without raising his voice. Mr. Halstead, the pool behind your house extends into the required setback. I checked the records and found no permit. Mrs. Halstead, your gazebo is registered as temporary, yet it has stood for 3 years on a permanent foundation. Malcolm, your dock and landscaped retaining wall sit within a protected canal buffer zone. Those modifications require special approval. The air in the room thickened. Someone whispered. Someone else stopped breathing. Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it. Malcolm stared down at his hands. Brent jumped to his feet and declared the meeting off track. Caleb nodded. Yes, he said. It is finally on the right track. He continued without looking at his notes. I measured slope at 7 points across the neighborhood. I recorded water arrival and recession times during the last 4 storms. The flow has been redirected, not by my wall, but by changes along the canal. Water does not disappear, it only goes somewhere else. Noah Jensen stood from the back row, his voice shaking but clear. Water entered my house before the heavy rain started. Machines ran all night. Lila gripped his hand. Another resident stood to talk about repair bills. Another mentioned insurance. Brent slammed his hand on the table and called for adjournment, but the room no longer obeyed. Questions flew fast and sharp. Why does the middle section always flood? Why is the canal side always dry? Vivian looked around, and for the first time found no supportive eyes. Caleb sat back down. He did not win with volume. He won with preparation. In his mind, years of being underestimated had quietly transformed into a kind of power that did not need to announce itself. He thought of Evelyn, of the wall, of water paths forced to go the wrong way. When the meeting collapsed into chaos and ended, Caleb stepped outside. Night had fallen. The wind carried the smell of rain. He took a deep breath. He knew he had just placed the first stone, not to build a wall, but to open a path. A white pickup truck stopped in front of Caleb's house while the sun had not yet cleared the line of palm trees, its door opening with a dry metallic sound like a judgment being delivered. A city emblem was stamped on the side. Brent Halstead stood behind it, his smile thin as paper. Caleb saw them through the kitchen window. Evelyn was stirring her tea, her movements slow and focused, as if the world had narrowed to the spoon and the surface of the water. He placed a hand gently on her back and whispered that he would be right back, then stepped outside and closed the door so softly it made no sound at all. The city inspector, a thin man named Alvarez with a clipboard pressed to his chest, stepped forward and introduced himself briefly. There had been a complaint about unpermitted electrical and structural work. Brent folded his arms and stood at just the right distance so everyone could see he was not giving orders, only observing. Vivian was not there. She rarely missed a performance unless she was certain she would win. Caleb nodded and invited them into the backyard, unhurried, unopposed. The posture of a cooperative homeowner, Alvarez began inspecting the lighting system mounted along the wall. He measured voltage, opened junction boxes, took notes. Time stretched tight. Brent lingered behind him, eyes moving from stone to stone, waiting for a small mistake to seize. None appeared. Alvarez straightened and said in a neutral tone that the system had been installed to code, even exceeding current safety requirements. Caleb produced additional documents, permits, approval stamps, inspection reports. Alvarez reviewed them and nodded. Brent clenched his jaw. The plot twist arrived in a sentence that sounded almost casual. "Since you are here, would you mind taking a look at one more thing?" Caleb led them to the back edge of the yard, near the canal. He pointed to newly poured concrete blocks and diverters set at altered angles. Alvarez crouched, ran his hand over the surface, pulled out a level and measured the slope. His brow tightened. "This is not listed in the infrastructure records," Alvarez said slowly. "Who authorized the change in drainage direction?" Brent stepped in, talking about older landscaping work, about previous contractors. Alvarez shook his head. "This concrete is new, less than 2 years old, and this is a major modification to shared drainage infrastructure." His pen moved faster. His tone shifted. "Changes like this require engineering approval and environmental review. Without permits, this is a serious violation." He looked at Brent and asked if he was aware this area bordered a protected canal buffer zone. Brent did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough for the wind to pass through, long enough for a few neighbors to stop and watch. Caleb stood still. He did not smile. He did not need to. Alvarez continued, explaining that after recent regional storms, the city had tightened drainage oversight, that violations could result in heavy fines and mandatory restoration. He spoke with the voice of someone who had read too many post-disaster reports. Brent forced a smile and said he would cooperate and provide records. Alvarez nodded and said he would file his report and that a comprehensive inspection might follow. When the pickup truck drove away, Brent lingered for a moment and looked at Caleb. The contempt was gone, replaced by confusion and calculation. "This does not need to go any further," Brent said. "We can handle this internally." Caleb met his gaze. "Water does not handle things internally," he replied. "It follows the land." Brent turned away and walked faster than necessary. By afternoon, the news rippled through the neighborhood. A city inspector had come. Infrastructure was under review. The community chat buzzed. Vivian posted a calming message about technical misunderstandings, but her words lacked their usual sharp edge. Noah Jensen knocked on Caleb's door and offered an awkward thank you, saying it was the first time he had seen anyone push back. Caleb only nodded. He knew this was just the beginning. That evening, Caleb sat beside Evelyn. She asked why there had been so many vehicles outside. He told her the city had come to inspect. She nodded, then asked softly if the water was still angry. Caleb thought for a moment. Water is not angry, he said. It just remembers. Outside, the canal shimmered under moonlight. The flow was still being forced, but the force had been seen. Caleb knew the people who were used to standing above everything were starting to lose their footing. He did not need to push them. He only needed to keep opening a path for the truth to flow. And in Seabreeze Palms, a balance had just shifted. Not because of the loudest voice, but because of the one who understood where water goes when it is no longer bent. The court order was delivered on a morning so quiet it felt unnatural, the thick envelope tapping against the door like a cold knock from fate itself. The demand to halt construction and remove the existing structure was printed right on the first page, blunt and without emotion. Caleb Hartman stood in the hallway, holding the papers, frozen. The smell of cooled coffee drifted from the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table, carefully folding napkins into neat squares, a habit that helped her keep order in her mind. When she noticed the change in his face, she looked up. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Caleb took a deep breath. He did not lie. He spoke slowly, choosing words she could follow. "The board has filed a lawsuit. They want the wall removed." Evelyn went silent. Her hand paused midair, then slowly lowered. She asked, as if asking about the weather, whether the water would come in again. Caleb placed his hand over hers. "No," he said, "not while I am still standing here." Meanwhile, Brent Halstead Jr. sat in his dark wood office, his lawyer standing by the window, voice smooth and hard like steel. "The filing is complete. The temporary order is in place. Now they will have to listen." Brent nodded, but unease churned inside him. The city inspector had not issued a conclusion yet. The neighborhood's water system was still under scrutiny. He needed to put out the fire quickly. Caleb did not put out fires. He made a phone call. Ethan Crow arrived around noon, carrying an old case packed with measuring equipment. Ethan was a hydraulic engineer, someone who had worked alongside Caleb during emergency projects when levees failed and entire neighborhoods had to evacuate. The two exchanged a quick embrace without words and went straight to work. Ethan set up instruments, stretched lines, recorded numbers. Each beep sounded like a heartbeat. He muttered about reversed slopes and forced flow rates. Caleb guided him through every marked point. They worked in the quiet understanding of men who had stood before floodwaters together. By afternoon, Ethan looked up, his eyes sharp and cold. "Your wall does not redirect water," he said. "It only protects and returns the flow to its natural state. But what is happening along the canal is different." The plot twist appeared in the report Ethan printed on the spot. The charts showed nearly 40% of rainwater volume being diverted from its natural path during heavy storms. The evidence was clear. An unpermitted system. Long-term impact. Ethan shook his head. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and knew exactly who they were hurting. Late in the afternoon, the board's lawyer arrived at Caleb's house. Dark suit, a smile just polite enough to mask his disdain. He proposed a settlement, remove the wall, and they would withdraw the lawsuit. Everything could return to normal. Caleb poured coffee and invited him to sit. He did not answer right away. Caleb placed Ethan's report on the table and spoke slowly, word by word. "My wall causes no harm, but the system by the canal does. It violates city regulations. It violates environmental protections. And if this lawsuit continues, it may become legal harassment against a family caring for someone who is ill." The lawyer read in silence, his brow tightening. He asked quietly about the data source. Ethan stepped in from the backyard and introduced himself, his calm voice familiar to anyone who had stood before technical review boards. The lawyer swallowed and said the matter would need further review, very careful review. When the visitor left, Caleb stood on the porch watching the sunset stain the canal red. Noah Jensen walked by and raised a hand in greeting. Another neighbor stopped to ask how things were going. No one looked at Caleb as a lone man anymore. News spread faster than rain. That night, Evelyn could not sleep. She asked again and again whether they would take the house. Caleb sat beside her bed and told her about a small dam from long ago, about how it held water in the right place so an entire village could live in peace. She listened, her eyes softening. When she finally slept, Caleb remained in the dark, staring at the court papers on the table. He was not afraid. He had seen this before. When people used the law like a club, they often forgot that the law is also like water. It seeks the lowest path. It seeks the truth. Outside, wind moved through the palm trees, carrying the scent of distant rain. Caleb knew the conflict had shifted. It was no longer about aesthetics or community rules. It was a confrontation between those who bent the flow and the man who knew how to return it. And this time, Caleb was not standing alone. Elaine Porter knocked on the door while the evening light was still warm, clutching a thick folder, as if it carried an entire buried past in her arms. The first thing she said was not a greeting. "I think they have been doing this for a very long time." Elaine was a 70-year-old woman who lived 3 houses down from Caleb. Silver hair neatly tied back, eyes sharp like a paper blade. She had once been an archival librarian, trained to follow the faintest traces and pull truth into the light. When the flooding kept happening and the board spoke in circles, she did not argue. She dug. Caleb invited her inside. Evelyn was having a good day, sitting quietly and listening as Elaine talked about gardens from long ago. When Elaine set the folder on the table, the weight of it landed with a dull thud. She opened it, revealing documents arranged like a silent indictment, original subdivision plans of Seabreeze Palms from 30 years earlier. Aerial photos taken before Brent Halstead bought the canal-side lots. Then photos taken afterward. The difference was impossible to miss. New water channels, unfamiliar concrete structures, a small pump station hidden behind a shed. Elaine pointed to one page. "This is an invoice from Halstead Coastal Development, marked as emergency storm mitigation. No permits, no community notice." The plot twist waited on the next page. A list of foreclosed homes in the middle section. 18 houses in 2 years. Chillingly consistent, every one of them had flooded at least twice before the owners could no longer keep up with fees and fines. The final buyer was always Brent's company or a related entity. Elaine spoke slowly, like reading the names of people erased from a map. They created the flooding. Then they bought cheap. Then they sold again after pushing the water somewhere else. Caleb stayed silent for a long time. He thought of Noah, of families who had moved out overnight, of Evelyn panicking when water rose. Every piece fit without force. Elaine was not finished. She produced another document, stamped by environmental authorities years earlier. The canal behind the Reeve property was classified as a protected buffer zone. Any watershed modification required federal approval. That unpermitted pump system was not just community fraud. It was an environmental crime. A cold clarity ran down Caleb's spine. Not fear, but understanding. This was no longer an HOA dispute. It was a scheme, a system designed to make money by bending water and crushing those without a voice. News spread quickly once Elaine started making calls. Her nephew David was an environmental attorney. He drove down from the city that night with flow meters and a list of agencies to notify. They worked without rest, measuring, recording, photographing, building files. Every number written out, every diagram, carefully labeled. This was not anger. This was preparation. Meanwhile, Brent called an emergency meeting with Vivian and Malcolm. Their voices were sharp and urgent. They talked about suppressing information, increasing legal pressure. Vivian suggested another calming post. Malcolm mentioned connections, but fear had entered the room, thick and suffocating. They knew they no longer controlled the story. Caleb stood on the porch as light rain began to fall. Not heavy, just enough to ripple the canal. He thought about the next step. Not revenge, but proof. If truth needed a moment to reveal itself, he would give it that moment. David spoke quietly about a possibility. The pump system had a central control. If the flow were restored during a major storm, everything would speak for itself. No destruction, no damage, Just restoration. Caleb listened. He knew the boundaries, and he also knew that sometimes justice needs the light of reality. That night, Evelyn slept peacefully. Elaine drank tea, her hands steady. Noah sent a message of thanks. A retired firefighter confirmed the pump location. A network formed without orders. Caleb closed the folder and looked toward the canal, where water was still being forced the wrong way. The truth had already been written. All that remained was the moment to read it aloud. And in Seabreeze Palms, those who relied on paperwork and authority had no idea the story about to be told would be written in a far older language, the language of water. The sound of a hammer striking rang out before the rain had time to fall. Dry and decisive, like a direct challenge. 3 blows, hitting the weakest point of the wall with precision. Caleb returned home on a gray afternoon, the smell of metal and shattered stone hitting his senses at once. He froze. A section of the drainage channel had been knocked out of alignment. A cornerstone split open, the inner lining exposed like an open wound. This was not random vandalism. It was the work of someone who knew exactly where to strike to make water betray the one protecting against it. The man standing beside the wall was Pete, a local contractor. His shirt dusted with stone powder, his hands trembling when he saw Caleb. He stammered about emergency repairs, about safety risks, about being hired on short notice. Caleb did not shout. He met his eyes, then raised his phone. The security footage played back everything. Pete entering the yard while it was still daylight, inspecting quickly, marking spots with chalk, then swinging the hammer. In the corner of the frame, a luxury vehicle sat parked not far away, its license plate reflecting sunlight. Caleb did not need to zoom in. He already knew. The plot twist was not in the video itself. It came in the next question Caleb asked. Pete, who paid you? Pete swallowed hard. $5,000. Cash. And a promise to erase his HOA fines. His voice cracked as he admitted it, saying he needed the money. Caleb looked at him not as a victim, but as someone who understood how systems crush the weak. He spoke slowly. You are not the vandal. You are the tool. Pete lowered his head, sweat running down his neck. Caleb offered a choice. Fix the wall immediately and do it properly. Take the full payment as promised, plus materials, and tell the truth. Pete hesitated, then nodded. The decision felt lighter than the hammer he had just dropped. Before the repairs were even finished, Brent Halstead Jr. appeared from behind the trees, walking with the confidence of someone who believed he still held control. He spoke about emergency intervention, about community safety, about the board's authority to act when a homeowner was absent. Caleb turned his camera back on and held it closer. Pete stood beside him in silence. Caleb spoke clearly, one word at a time. Destruction of property, criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit fraud. Brent laughed and said he would call the police. Caleb nodded. Please do. And bring your lawyer with you. Brent turned away, walking faster than he had arrived. That night, Pete repaired the wall under work lights. Caleb stood beside him, checking every joint and every slope. The wall was restored, even stronger than before. Test water flowed through obediently, following the correct path. Evelyn watched from the window and asked softly if everything was all right. Caleb nodded and said it was almost finished. The next morning, the HOA email exploded like a starting gun. An emergency meeting notice about a safety threat caused by one non-compliant individual. Photos of Caleb's wall were circled in red, covered in dense annotations. The meeting time lined up perfectly with the Sunday night storm forecast. The timing was almost too perfect. While Vivian posted calming messages about order and discipline, a separate network of residents quietly formed. Noah Jensen sent a list of flooded families. Elaine Porter forwarded completed files. David submitted formal complaints to agencies. A local reporter texted asking about the meeting time. The network tightened, silent but strong. Caleb did not post. He prepared. He rechecked every stone and every drainage channel. He tested backup power. He spoke with Pete and aligned their statements. He visited Noah and advised him to prepare dry supplies. He stood by the canal, watching the water begin to rise as the wind shifted, the metallic scent of rain filling his lungs. By Sunday afternoon, the sky pressed down on Seabreeze Palms. The community center filled to capacity. Brent wore a dark blazer. Vivian stood beside him with a fixed smile. Malcolm checked his watch again and again. Outside, rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, like drums building tempo. Inside the meeting room, Brent spoke about risk. Vivian spoke about aesthetics. They spoke quickly, trying to stay ahead of the sound of rain. When Caleb stood, the murmurs faded. He did not speak long. He spoke about data, about original plans, about 18 houses, about invoices, about the hammer and the video. Thunder cracked. Phones vibrated in Vivian's pocket, then Brent's, then Malcolm's. Faces drained of color. At the same time, water began pooling in the parking lot outside, then spilling over. The glass doors trembled. Caleb looked around calmly and said that when you bend water for too long, it remembers the way home. Outside, rain poured like a waterfall, and along the canal, where those who manipulated the system believed they were safe, the water was changing direction. The sound of water crashing into the Halstead basement hit like a belated confession, thick and heavy, sweeping away furniture, paperwork, and beliefs that had been built on sand. No one in the meeting room talked about aesthetics anymore. Rain hammered down. Windows rattled. Lights flickered. In the chaos, Brent Halstead Jr.'s phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor, the screen lighting up with urgent messages. Water in the garage. The pumps are not working. The basement is flooding fast. Vivian stood frozen, her lips moving without sound, as if language itself had abandoned her. Malcolm Reeve shoved his chair back and sprang up, his voice breaking as he called his insurance company, then falling silent when the answer came. No coverage for damage caused by unpermitted infrastructure changes. Caleb stood still in the noisy room. He did not smile. He did not raise his hands in victory. He simply looked out the window, where rain had turned the parking lot into a gray mirror. His wall, in the middle section, still stood firm. Water found its path. The right path. It flowed quietly through the drainage channels that had been guided from the beginning. The door flew open, and a local reporter rushed in with a camera. Raincoat soaked through. She asked one short question: "What is happening?" Brent rushed to talk about sabotage and illegal interference. Caleb turned, his voice low. "No one sabotaged anything. We restored it. The water is going where it always belonged." Outside, cameras captured images no one could deny. Water pouring into the Halstead driveway, carrying rugs, boxes, and framed photos that once hung neatly on walls. Vivian cried, her sobs swallowed by the rain. Malcolm stood under the awning with water climbing to his ankles, the stunned look of someone experiencing powerlessness for the first time. In the days that followed, everything fell like a line of dominoes. Environmental agencies opened investigations. The city ordered full restoration. Fines were announced, long and heavy like night rain. Brent's company had its assets frozen pending inquiry. The old board dissolved through quiet resignation letters. No more emergency meetings. No more violation notices. No more mocking laughter. In Seabreeze Palms, people began to clean up, not just mud, but fear and silence. Families who had flooded received help with repairs. A new management board was elected, transparent and deliberate. They brought in independent engineers. They spoke about natural flow like an old friend that deserved respect. Pete opened a small business specializing in properly engineered flood protection systems. Noah Jensen kept his home. Elaine Porter created a digital archive, documenting everything so no one could ever claim ignorance again. David continued pursuing similar cases, carrying lessons from a neighborhood that once believed itself untouchable. Caleb and Evelyn sat on the porch one evening during a gentle rain. No storm, just rain. Water passed smoothly by, like a late apology from the earth itself. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder and asked if the wall was still beautiful. Caleb smiled and said it was beautiful because it was right. He thought about the years of being underestimated, about how real power does not need a podium. It lives in understanding, in patience, in the courage to stand still until truth steps forward on its own. Water always wins, he used to say, but not through force, through memory. As the story spread beyond the neighborhood, letters arrived. People wrote about their boards, their Karens, their familiar threats. Caleb read slowly. He did not promise miracles. He offered one answer: learn to read the flow, and do not be afraid to ask questions. If you have ever lived in a community where your voice was dismissed, where decisions were made behind ink and smiles, tell your story. Leave a comment below and share what you have seen. If this story reminds you that truth still has a path, press like. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe so we can keep telling them. Slowly, but never in silence.